Hi gang, it's Robin Schneider and I'm glad to be back as a guest lecturer on Zoe's channel. This week I'm going to show you how to add fabric to a fashion illustration and make it look like it's wrapped around the body. Digital draping, if you will. Zoe did a quick sketch, scanned it in and sent it off to me, and she also scanned in some fabric and sent that to me as well. And she did something really awesome with the fabric, and that is she scanned it next to a ruler so I can gauge the scale that the fabric is supposed to be when I put it on the illustration. So let's start by turning this into a seamless repeat pattern. So what I need to do is determine what the repeat is, and then I'm going to copy a small section of this to a new layer. And I know the repeat is going to be a series of 4 circles, so I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee and just make a selection that's a bit larger than 4 circles, and I'm going to copy it to a new layer. And the shortcut key for that is Control-J or Command-J. And now I'll turn off the layer underneath, and let's zoom in nice and close to this and turn it into a seamless repeat. First thing I need to do is turn on the rulers, and that's Control R or Command R for rulers. And then we need to drag out some guidelines. So I'm going to click inside the top ruler and drag it straight down. And then again inside the top ruler and drag it straight down. And you can see this is where my repeat is going to be. A light green, then a dark green. And then on this side, dark green, light green. Now I'm going to click inside my ruler and go ahead and drag one this way. And I'm going to do it one more time. Drag it right over here. And this is going to be my repeat. So I just want to take a look and make sure everything appears to be straight. And it looks pretty good. So now with the rectangle marquee, I can just click and drag inside these guidelines. And it doesn't feel like it's snapping. So I'm going to deselect that and just make sure that under View, Snap is checked. Now you can see it's got a little check next to it, and I can grab the rectangular marquee and go ahead and make the selection and go up to Edit and select Define Pattern. And that's going to turn this into a pattern. All right, now that that's ready to go, let's go back to our image. To keep this from getting too long, I've already cleaned up and filled Zoe's sketch with flat color. If you need a refresher on how to do this, you can watch the How to Render Fashion Illustrations in Adobe Photoshop video. All right, so as you can see, I've got my sketch. It's all cleaned up. And then I went ahead and filled each of these areas with flat color just to have something to work with. So let's get started. I'm going to zoom in, and the first thing we're going to fill is the belt. So I'll click on the belt layer, take my rectangle marquee, draw a rectangle around the belt area, click on the black and white cookie, and we are going to go to pattern. Now, here's where I have an option to scale the pattern. I know it's going to be at least 25%, potentially even smaller. Remember, it looked like, if we go back to this window, oops, we're going to have to cancel in order to do that. It looked, according to this, that 1 inch is about 2 of these circles. So I'm going to assume that this is maybe 2 inches long. So let's go back to the cookie pattern. We're going to fill, and let's try 15. I think that will be kind of close. It might actually be a little bit smaller than this, but I'm afraid if I make it too small, it's not going to read well on the screen. So let's stick with 15 and click OK. Now, I don't want to see all this crazy stuff going on here. It's kind of distracting. So I'm going to right click on that pattern fill, and we're going to select, where is it? Create Clipping Mask. And that's going to stick the pattern to the layer just below it, which was the color fill I had for the belt. And now we need to do one more thing before we can manipulate it further. We're going to right click on the pattern fill again and select Convert to Smart Object. And now we can work with it. So we're going to transform this, Control T to transform. And I'm going to start by rotating it a bit so it's on the same direction or flowing in the same direction as the garment. And now I can right click and select Warp. Now with warp, you can either click right on the image and drag, or you can click on any of these corners and move them and mess with the handles. So I'm going to curve this up a little bit. I'm going to curve or move this side in a little bit so that the pattern is following the line of the body. This side looks pretty good. We just need to curve this up a little bit. Now I want to be careful I don't smush anything, but I definitely want it to follow the flow here. All right, so now that piece is done, and I'll click the little checkbox. We'll do the knot next. Click on the knot layer, grab the rectangle marquee, draw a little box around the knot, go down to the cookie and fill it with the pattern, which we decided on 15%. I'm going to go ahead and right-click, create clipping mask, right-click, convert to smart object, and then Control or Command T to transform, and I can rotate this into place. And this one doesn't need to be warped at all. So that's how you do the simpler ones. Now let's go ahead and work on the top. I'm going to click on the layer for the top, take my rectangle marquee, and draw a rectangle around just half the top. The way that we're going to select the areas to use, think of it as each pattern piece gets its own piece of fabric. So I'm going to assume that this front was made of 2 pieces. So we're going to take that piece, we're going to go to the cookie, select pattern, we'll select again 15%, click OK. We're going to clip it, so right-click, create clipping mask, and then right-click, convert to smart object. And now we can rotate it into place. Control or Command T to transform. We'll rotate it first to get it moving in the right direction. And then right-click, warp, and we can do any distortion. So I'm going to curve this out a little bit, curve the top up and the bottom down. And then I'm going to take this side and I'm going to really squish it in here because this is gathered into the knot and I want it to look that way. So it gives us the effect over here of gathers because it's kind of scrunched in. And let's make sure that this part is okay. And I would say that looks pretty good. So I'm going to click OK. And now we can sort of cheat for the other side. We can just take this piece and flip it for the other side. So we're going to go to the layer with this pattern fill, right-click, duplicate layer, just click OK. So now I've got a second one. And now I'm going to go to my Move tool, and I'm just going to slide it over to the other side. But it's angled in the wrong direction. So I'm going to transform, Control T to transform, right-click. We're going to select Flip Horizontal, so it flips it in the other direction. And now I can just move it into place. Let's zoom out just a little bit. Now I can move this into place and just rotate it as needed so that it follows the lines of the body. And that looks pretty good. So we'll click OK. Now we have one last piece to do, and that's the skirt. I'll zoom out just a little bit more. So again, we take the rectangle marquee, we drag a rectangle over the skirt. Oh, I did skip a step though. I need to make sure that I'm in the skirt layer. All right, so there's my marquee. I'm in the skirt layer. We'll click on the cookie, select pattern, and again, 15% scale. Click OK. And then the same steps. Right-click, create clipping mask, right-click, convert to smart object, and then transform. Control or Command T for transform. We'll first rotate this into place, then right-click, warp, and we can go ahead and bend this stuff in a little bit. We'll bend this side in a little, and we're going to pull the bottom out. And again, I'm making sure this follows the curve of the skirt and of the body. So we'll pull that out this way. This looks pretty good over here. Maybe this, oops, maybe this wants to move in this way a little bit. I'm looking at this line and making sure that it's following the hem of the skirt. or the side of the skirt. I'm making sure that this is curved to match the seam over here. And we're pulling this in a little bit, and we're going to pull this out a little bit to help it follow the line of the side of the skirt. And we'll curve the bottom a little bit, and I think we're in pretty good shape. All right, and we'll click the little check mark, and we're done. So now that I've got the fabric here, it would be really nice to add a little shading to this. And in the previous video, we talked about shading using dodge and burn, but unfortunately that technique is not going to work for this type of situation. So you can see if I grab the burn tool and I try and burn on this pattern fill, I get this message. It says the smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Is that okay? And the answer is no, it's never okay. Do not rasterize this image. We need it to be a smart object so that some tricks I show you later are going to work. So we're canceling this. And instead, we're going to add a shading layer. So I'm going to click on the top sketch layer. We'll make a new layer. And I'm going to call this one shading. And then we're going to make one more new layer on top of that. And we're going to call this one highlights. All right, so let's go into the shading layer. I probably should have called it shadows, but we're going to leave it at shading. And we are going to make sure we have black paint. We're going to go select a brush, and then we're going to drop down in this control bar to get this brush. We want soft, round, pressure, opacity. And you'll find it in the general brushes folder. So we'll just open that up. Soft, round, pressure, opacity. And this brush means if we push lightly, we'll get a light amount of paint. And if we push hard, we'll get darker, heavier paint. Now I'm going to switch from a mouse to a Wacom tablet so I have a little more control with what I'm doing here. We're going to go up to opacity and we're going to lower that quite a bit. Going to go, let's go to like 10%. We'll start at something really low. Now I can make the brush bigger or smaller using the bracket key and go ahead and start shading this. So maybe we'll give this a little bit of shade down the side. And every time I lift the brush and put it back down, it adds another layer darkening the shading. So we'll throw a little bit down here and probably a little bit here. And then I'll make the brush smaller using the bracket keys. And we'll throw a little shading around the knot. And we'll throw some shading in these creases. And remember, every time you lift your pen and put it back down, it'll make it a little bit darker. So now I've got some shading going on here on the top. Let's make the brush a little bit bigger and work our way down the figure. And now we're going to intensify this over here by adding some shading to this. Okay, so now that I've got my shadows in, let's go back and add some highlights. We're going to switch to the highlight layer. I'm going to swap my color so that I'm using white. I'm going to leave all the other settings the same, and I'm going to throw in some highlights. So to make this brush a tiny bit bigger, and we'll throw a few highlights down here on the skirt, maybe a little bit here, the top of the chest, make my brush smaller, and maybe there's a little highlight inside the knots. This is a really nice way to do shadows and highlights because if I made them too heavy, I can always go into the layer that I worked in and lower the opacity so that they're much softer. So it gives me actually a lot more flexibility over the shading than using dodge and burn did in the first place. Now that we've got all the highlights and shadows, we're going to need to get rid of this mess here around the outside, and that's really simple to do. We're going to click on the sketch layer, go over to our tools and select the magic wand, and then we're going to click inside to get this little piece, hold the shift key, and click on the outside to get the rest of the white. And now we'll click on the highlights layer and hit delete on your keyboard, and click on the shading layer and hit delete on your keyboard. And it's going to remove all of that extra shading that we don't need to see outside of the dress. We'll deselect, Control or Command D, and there you go. we've got a fabric wrapped around the body and shaded. Now let me show you one little trick and the main reason for using the smart object. In fashion, we know oftentimes things change and they change quickly. And this fabric may no longer be available, or maybe this dress was such a good seller that we want to put it out in a second fabric. Well, if you laid out your file this way, it's really, really easy to change the fabric. All I need to do is double click on the smart object for the pattern fill, double click again on the pattern fill, and then switch to a different one. We're going to grab this. Click OK. We're going to close this tab, and it asks if we want to save the changes. The answer is yes. And it changed both those pieces. We're just going to do that to the rest of the fabric, and it'll change everything out. So we'll double click on this pattern fill, double click, and switch to this. Click OK, close, yes, and scroll down. Oh, that was the knot. Let's grab the belt, double click on the pattern fill, double click, switch fabric, click OK, close, yes. And finally, the pattern fill for the skirt, which is right over here. We'll double click on the smart object, double click on the pattern, swap it out, click OK, and yes, we'll save. Now, how cool is that? We've got the shading, the highlights and the shadows on separate layers, so we haven't lost that. And by changing this out, changing out the fabric inside the smart object, it kept all the warping that we had applied to the smart object. And so I've got new garment in here and it's already warped. Please give this video a thumbs up if you learned something new. And if you have any questions, you can always leave them in the comment section. If you want to learn more Adobe skills for fashion, you can visit my YouTube channel or watch my courses on LinkedIn Learning. Zoe will add the links below. And remember, nobody masters these skills overnight. It takes practice, but I promise it's worth it.